Signal is a podcast by the Bucks County Beacon. I'm your host and the Beacon's editor-in-chief, Cyril Mychalejko. Twice a month, we'll use this space to shine a light on the right-wing extremist currents streaming through Bucks County and beyond. We'll talk to guests who will help listeners navigate these perilous political waters by providing insight, analysis, and organizing solutions so that we can steer the community toward calmer, saner, progressive routes. Mike Wendling is U.S. national digital reporter for the BBC based in Chicago. In 2020, he co-founded the BBC News' Disinformation Unit and was editor and presenter of Trending, the BBC World Services show that covers the world of social media. He has decades of experience covering extremism, the American far right, social media, and disinformation. Today, Mike joins us to talk about his new book, out May 20th, called Day of Reckoning: The Far Right's War on Democracy. Hi, Mike. Welcome to The Signal.
Hi, Cyril. Thanks very much for having me. It's great to be here.
So to start us off, could you just explain how and why you became a journalist?
Yeah, sure. Well, this is going back a little while, end of last century, but I grew up in Western New York, and writing and talking to people was always something that I was very interested in. I've always kind of been interested in the a couple of things: technology and the way that people socialize online, and the fringes of politics. Not necessarily the mainstream, although I've covered quite a few political campaigns over the years. I worked for the Associated Press here in the United States. I moved to England for a few months, and that turned out to be 20 years. And most of that time I've spent working for the BBC. And of course, my specialist interest areas have kind of, I suppose, grown tremendously, and then also kind of interacted and bounced off of each other. So about 10 years ago, I was involved in a big pilot that the BBC was doing called BBC Trending, which became a unit devoted to covering the world of social media. And specifically, it was a digital, property, but also a radio show on the BBC World Service. And as such, we looked into trends all around the world, right? Obviously, the BBC has a very big footprint in many different countries. Around 2015, 2016, of course, the alt-right comes to prominence in America, riding on the coattails of Donald Trump's campaign. And suddenly there's an online movement that's quite radical and has extremist elements. In fact, perhaps arguably dominated by extremists. And they're all sort of talking in coded language online. And that's kind of really what propelled my current interest in these kinds of things, particularly extremism here in the U.S. It's developed, as has the world of online disinformation and conspiracy theories, until we find ourselves at the current moment, which is very interesting.
Okay, so you've made this your beat, essentially, covering extremism, the far right, social media, and disinformation, and how they all kind of tie in together. Can you explain your reporting process about how you're covering maybe say the far right, the alt-right within social media, and how, as well as how disinformation is spread through that?
Yeah, sure. And I guess I would point out that, there's a lot of overlap and there's a lot of interrelations here, but it's not necessarily, believing in conspiracies doesn't make you an extremist, and not all extremists are entirely conspiratorial, although, as I've learned, and maybe we'll talk about, that it's increasingly becoming that way. I look for, I suppose, things on the fringes, which over the course of the last 10 plus years in covering this kind of stuff, it's become more apparent to me about how these things sort of move into the mainstream. You know what I mean? So let me just give you a concrete example. I did a television documentary about the Proud Boys, and I remember an editor asking me, obviously these guys are interesting. They're radical. They have these strange behaviors and rules, and they punch each other while naming breakfast cereals in order to get initiated into their club. It sounds like a great bit of television that you can make. But are these guys going to have any real impact on politics? Now, that was in 2018. If only I had the foresight to say, yes, they are going to be at the center of an armed rebellion, that's going to target the Capitol. I don't view into the future in that, but I suppose there's patterns that you can kind of see, right? And frankly, some patterns that you can't see. When I was starting to cover the QAnon movement, we really didn't see that. Again, you would end up with the QAnon shaman busting into the Senate chamber and writing a note for Mike Pence on January the 6th. But you got to kind of, this thing happens over and over again. So you got to kind of have to keep an open mind. So I keep feelers out and I make a look at all of these sort of fringe movements and see where the steam is for our general audience in the BBC. And again, we have a significant audience here in the US, but we're the sort of the 800-ton gorilla in the UK, and then listeners and viewers and readers all over the world. So a lot of what I'm doing is, I suppose, monitoring these things, and not everything necessarily sort of makes it into a story for the BBC or for every sort of BBC outlet. When I'm ready to sort of cover something that's breaking into the mainstream, I'm there. To give you just an example, the story's not out yet, but I was in Detroit over the weekend, and I was at a fundraiser for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And clearly, if the current trajectory continues, and we aren't sort of subject to some sort of crazy bombshell, or if he decides that he's sick of running, which he shows no indications of doing, he's going to have a significant impact on the election. I'm trying to answer the question of what exactly that impact might be, but clearly there's something happening on the fringes here amongst his supporters that's going to be very influential come November.
I mean, do you think he could have like a Ross Perot type showing, or?
So from the experts that I've spoken to, and what I know about sort of the history, politics in the 90s, he doesn't poll quite as much as Ross Perot. That said, he certainly is the most popular independent candidate at this point that we've seen in decades. Much more popular than the perennial sort of green libertarian candidates, who themselves have had some impact, arguably, on elections in the recent past. So yeah, it's definitely a factor. I mean, I guess, not to sort of like spoil the story that I'm about to write, but I feel that the tide might be turning. Obviously, the Democratic Party is very concerned about his impact. However, most of the people that I spoke to at that fundraiser said that they had previously voted for Trump, or were even considering voting for Trump again, even though they were at a Robert F. Kennedy Jr. fundraiser. So that just gives a little bit of pause, along with some other sort of more, less anecdotal, more scientific polls and surveys and stuff that have been done, and what experts tell me too. So it's a curious picture. It's by no means conclusive or clear, but it'll be interesting. That's for sure.
Well, let's get into your book now, which comes out May 20th. It's called Day of Reckoning: How the Far Right Waged War on Democracy. What led you to write this?
What led me to write this was something that I had observed, I suppose, over the last few years. To take it back and sort of maybe fill in a little bit of the story that you initially asked me about. In 2020, I was one of several editors at the BBC who developed a new unit called the Disinformation Unit, which is now known as BBC Verify through various iterations. We started to see the impact of conspiracy theories on politics. Initially, we thought we were going to sort of be very tuned into the election that year, but this was February 2020, and of course, we all know what happened in early 2020. So it became a lot about sort of looking into COVID conspiracies, and then a little bit later down the line, obviously, vaccine conspiracy theories that were related to COVID conspiracy theories. I guess what I saw is an interesting sort of conflation of a lot of different rumors and falsehoods and conspiracy theories. And they were slowly overtaking the far right, or what used to be called the alt-right in America. This was a movement that was born online and that was full of memes and full of jokes. It gave extremists plausible deniability. So they could post something that had, a a picture of a Pepe the Frog in a Nazi gear or whatever, and then they could say, "Oh, we're just joking," and this was just constant. The joking was just constant. But then, by 2020, the sort of playfulness and like the humor had almost entirely evaporated. The Pepe memes were getting a little bit passé, and there was a newfound seriousness, and there was a newfound paranoia, and it would revolved around COVID, but then it also, of course, revolved around Donald Trump's false claims of voter fraud. It involved around things like chemtrails and the usual sort of far-right conspiracies that were sort of rearing their head again, sovereign citizen type conspiracy theories where, people think that the New World Order is going to take over and that there's going to be a one world government. United Nations has mostly been supplanted by, Davos in the popular imagination of the far right, but certainly the sort of idea is the same, that some people from far away are going to institute a government, and that government is going to be either socialist or communist or fascist, whatever you most fear. And it was curious to me because at the same time, a lot of these people were actually getting elected. They were achieving positions of power, and they were talking about these things in state houses and in Congress. So, with this in mind, and obviously with this year's election in mind, and there was a possibility to move back to the U.S. and report for the BBC from here, which I took. And so after 20 years, I moved back, and I really sort of set it about as my mission to kind of meet these people where they were, talk to them, find out the stories of some of the people who were sort of leading these movements and these ideas, but then also people who had just kind of been tied up in conspiracy and conspiracy thinking. People who might not have necessarily been so far into the world that is more familiar from the likes of InfoWars and David Icke. People who in the past you would have considered to be, normal conservatives or libertarians or Republicans, and we're suddenly spewing all sorts of crazy stuff. And this book, I suppose, is my attempt to make sense of all this and try to explain it to people who are interested in, perhaps a little bit worried about what's going to happen in November.
How does conspiracy and conspiracy theories inform far-right thinking and ideology today? And how do they use that conspiracies as a pipeline to kind of marshal people into their movements?
Yeah. So, I mean, conspiracy there's always been a conspiratorial element in the far right, and there's always been paranoia. And, in some ways, for those of us who are not extremists, that's a good thing, because what it does is that it naturally limits the movement. It's really hard to build a coalition when you're a conspiracist, because you are just suspicious of everyone. So the people who join your movement, you might be suspicious of them, maybe for good reason. Maybe they might actually be FBI informants, but maybe you just don't like them and you're making false accusations. So it's really kind of a movement killer. That's always been present. I suppose it became what I found interesting is, like I say, when the alt-right was first growing, they were using conspiracy theories almost as a tool. They were as anything else. They would joke about it. So I had several sort of alt-right people who were like joking about things like Pizzagate, this unfounded rumor that the Democratic Party and top Democratic officials were running a child sex trafficking ring out of a Washington, D.C. pizza parlor, complete fiction. But, they didn't really take it seriously. What they did is they saw the power of these things to motivate people, right? So you get a lot of chatter online, and then it just doesn't look good for whoever you're targeting with this conspiracy theory. And that's the root of the political power of a conspiracy theory. And sorry, I'm going off on a tangent, and I can't even remember what your question was, or if I've answered it.
I was asking, like, how does conspiracy inform far right thinking, and then how does the far right use conspiracy to kind of marshal people that might otherwise not be that might not associate with them into their movements.
Yeah. So I think like that's a good example. But for the latter part of what you're asking, COVID was a perfect example of that. So vaccine skepticism, as I try to lay out in the book, there's a huge range. Actually, there's studies that indicate that the number one reason for people who don't get vaccines of any sort is because they don't like needles, and they particularly just don't want that. They're not reading loads of stuff online that say vaccines are full of poison and they're going to kill you or whatever. But they just think, what, I'll take my chances. It's fine. I just really don't like that. But then there's also a significant block of people who aren't necessarily signed up for any far right ideas. You might call them, yoga, natural living types, California hippies, people who would be more associated with progressive values, with Democratic Party, with environmentalism and spiritualism, these kinds of things. And I'm sure that a lot of your listeners know some of these people who now suddenly sound more or less the same as a MAGA supporter. And that is bizarre. That is crazy. But just shows you the power of these conspiracy theories when tuned to the right frequency, I suppose, to carry on the sort of hippie vibes. It shows the power of them to draw people into these movements. Vaccine hesitancy is a very complicated subject. Probably most of the people who are a little bit iffy about taking a vaccine or who don't want a COVID vaccine, because there are sort of different sort of severities of disease. And we now know a lot more about COVID than we did in early 2020. Not all of them are buying into these conspiracy theories, but it does affect behavior because, certainly I have heard people who don't believe the conspiracy theories, but don't take vaccines because it plays on their mind. Like it clearly just plays on their mind. I personally was kind of astonished to find that like vaccines were becoming political again. I thought that perhaps the fact that you had sort of people who, were from the hard right, John Birch Society type Republicans, and then also these kind of hippies vaguely from the left might make that whole anti-vax movement a little bit less political. And you kind of see this in the RFK Jr. campaign a little bit. But generally, that energy has been harnessed by people on the right and on the far right. Again, not all extremists, but certainly some of them are.
No, it's something that we've seen here in Bucks County with the local reopen movement, which started obviously, against the lockdowns and school closures, and a lot of these same actors. There was a relationship between them and like this like local militia group, and then a lot of the people from the reopen movement kind of were marshaled into the Moms for Liberty, school board wars, that we're still seeing play out as of today.
Yeah, I mean, what you're seeing, I suppose, is what loads of people in all sorts of places around the country are seeing. It has drawn in the moms groups, the Moms for Liberty type. It has drawn in a bunch of people who weren't necessarily sort of tuned into politics before. I mean, I always find it very curious because, obviously advocating to reopen businesses under COVID, was not necessarily a conspiracy theory. There was a lot of conspiratorial stuff that was fueling this stuff, but it was a legitimate political argument.
It was partisan.
Yeah, it was partisan. It didn't necessarily have to be partisan, I suppose. I suppose there's, there's a various different political flavors of argument that could be used to say, hey, we need to help the workers, we need to help the business owners or whatever. But internally, the logic kind of broke down. A lot of the activists who were really out front weren't pushing things like, yes, we need to reopen businesses, but we need to do it safely. So, we're going to have, we're all going to agree to wear masks in a certain amount of time. Generally, it was just a blanket no. We want things open, and we do not want to wear masks, and we do not want vaccines, and we do not want, you can imagine a political movement that would say, hey, you know what? We are going to push for even mandatory vaccines. But in exchange, we would like freedom. We want the end to lockdowns once we reach 80% vaccination or whatever. I'm just pulling this out. You know what I mean? Like internally, logically, and perhaps scientifically. I mean, scientists, I'm sure, will point out some flaws in my own logic, but that is coherent. But a lot of the people who were pushing these kinds of movements didn't really have any of that logical coherence.
No, and I mean, if we look back, President Trump had a lot to do with like the vaccines, right? And some of the lockdowns. But I think it was just something, the GOP was able to kind of like weaponize it, right? Whereas it seems like the whole arguments were more focused on like Democratic controlled states or cities, more so than just like having some kind of like good faith debate about what's the best way to kind of handle this like global public health crisis, within the borders of the United States. But let's go ahead and pivot to like another prominent conspiracy theory, which actually brought you to Pennsylvania, to Scranton, where you attended a QAnon rally on July 4th back in 2019. Could you take us there and tell us about like what you saw, what you heard, what you learned?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it was a fascinating event for the reasons I have sort of outlined, which are there was this very rabid online movement. And at the time, there was really no telling that it would become something that would, inspire lots of people to go to the Capitol on January the 6th. You know what I mean? In fact, I didn't really sort of put this out there in the reporting at the time because it would have been a little bit underwhelming, and I don't really like to make predictions because they're invariably wrong. If you asked me at the time, oh, is this something that's going to be a big deal? I probably would have been, after that weekend, I probably would have been like, no way. Several big QAnon influencers were invited to the wonderful hotel that used to be Scranton's train station, I believe, right in the middle of town. It's a fantastic hotel. And some supporters of Donald Trump had rented out a ballroom, and they had built it as sort of like a pro-Trump tour without Trump. And of course, this is the summer before the election. So, only the hardcore people are really paying attention to presidential politics at that time. It was ill-managed. It was ill-planned. I felt almost like sorry for the organizers who were, stumping up the money to have this and only to sort of see like a quarter empty ballroom in this hotel. But what really brought the takeaway that I really got was this: the speakers were sort of, they had gotten large social media following, several of the speakers. And I detail one in the book, Dylan Wheeler, who's since sort of gone off the movement. But he had gotten a large social media following with his account, which was Educating Liberals on Twitter. And if you're into the Twitter X universe, you probably saw some of his tweets 5 years ago. He had hundreds of thousands of followers before he sort of quit the game. They were a mix of like conservative red meat, things like, wokeism has gone mad, et cetera, and QAnon stuff, and the very sort of like esoteric part of QAnon, the numerology and the decoding the Q drops, which were these messages that Q was pumping out to followers. And then when I went around and I talked to people who were listening to this stuff, to the speeches, that is, they weren't hardcore Q people. They weren't there for the Q stuff. They were there for the red meat. But you'd ask them about the QAnon stuff, and they would say, oh, yeah, I believe some of that, maybe not. It was more of like a vibe. They thought that children were at risk, generally, maybe not specifically, or maybe, and certainly they weren't like going to 4chan and 8chan and consuming the Q content directly. It was all stuff they had heard about on accounts like Educating Liberals and a bunch of other sort of Q influencer accounts. So they were getting this sense of QAnon secondhand, and it was melding with, hey, the woke people are out to get your children. And it was kind of forging what we have seen today, where you have Congress people who are talking about space lasers, the sort of basic tenets of QAnon, that people are coming for your children and they're going to force them to change gender, and the woke ideology is going to infect the schools. And it's all wrapped up in this sort of bag of conspiracy. And that's the first time that I really kind of saw that in practice, and there was a bunch of sort of oddballs and hangers on and fringe candidates and characters who had come into that event. Again, if you had told me, hey, this is the core of something that's going to cause something like what happened on January the 6th, I would have laughed at the time. But then clearly it did.
And I just want to note that another one of the speakers at this event was Scott Pressler. So this is someone, a MAGA activist who's really been embraced locally by the Bucks County GOP and different GOP affiliates here, and who also is just often brought on as a guest to a local radio program, the Dom Giordano Show on 12:10
Right.
p.m. But he's someone who has a real national profile now, especially with like the GOP's like get out the vote, and they're kind of they're now trying to embrace mail-in voting, which President Trump had previously just derided as part of the way that Democrats supposedly stole, which they didn't, his election.
Yeah, I haven't actually. I would like to catch up with Scott because, he was on the bill. I don't believe that he was spreading QAnon stuff at the time. I'd have to check. I'm not sort of 100% about that, but it certainly wasn't like a major part of his brand and isn't really now. But you're right. He's become a very sort of prominent GOP activist. He appears on Steve Bannon's show quite a while. Like, yeah, he sort of does a lot of kind of on the ground activism. I believe, I'm not sure where this is, but I did read a report that Laura Trump, who's now co-chair of the Republican Party, was going to bring him on for in their sort of voter integrity or their sort of get out the vote efforts. I'm not sure actually where that is. I'd have to check. But yeah, certainly that kind of shows how some of these people, I mean, another one of the organizers there later ran for the Republican nomination for Senate in Delaware. I mean, she obviously didn't win as a Republican in Delaware, but it's interesting sort of like all these sort of offshoots of people who sort of like pop up over the years, I suppose. And that sort of move to increase mail-in ballots. This is a perfect example of how the paranoia about anything can backfire. I find it very interesting, and I'm very kind of keen to do some more reporting about how much effort the Republican Party is going to put into these, because it's difficult to tell your voters that mail-in ballots are fraudulent and that absentee voting is a bad thing to do, and there's all sorts of chicanery, and then turn around and say, yeah, please do this, bank your vote. And you're just sort of, one bad snowstorm in Wisconsin away from, a few thousand of your voters not being able to get out on election day. And that's a real risk. And obviously the higher ups in the Republican Party sort of realize this and are trying to do something about it. So I'm just very curious about where this goes and whether they can actually convince a lot of the core MAGA supporters to, vote early or vote by mail.
I would suggest that Bucks County would be a great case study for that, because you do have the MAGA base, which has traditionally, up until now at least, been vehemently opposed to kind of mail-in voting. But you have figures like locally Jim Worthington, who's like a MAGA millionaire, owner of the Newtown Athletic Club, this big gym in Bucks County. He was a Trump delegate. He's running for delegate again. He was very active. I think he had a fundraising role in Mehmet Oz's campaign. He announced that he's putting money into creating an organization to help get Republicans to actually kind of embrace mail-in voting, because him and even the local radio host out of Philly, Dom Giordano, is kind of just like a wannabe Rush Limbaugh. He also has embraced this. But one funny thing about it in Pennsylvania is, like, while they're, a lot of these Republicans are complaining about mail-in voting and how it's a Democratic ruse to kind of like rig the vote, it was actually something that was voted in by Republicans along party lines in 2019. Act 77 was someone like Republican Senator Doug Mastriano voting for mail-in voting at the time, while today he's one of the biggest, opponents of it. So it's just, it's just another example of just kind of them like rewriting history in order to kind of like fit their narrative.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely for the political purposes. Logistically, electorally, is probably benefits Republicans, because a lot of the people who are availing themselves of these are people who might be older, can't get around as well, etc. You would think generally. Yeah, it's very interesting, and it could be, we think at this point that the election is going to be so tight, and all indications and all polls sort of are pointing in this direction, that these things could really have a big impact. Yeah, I mean, can they really reverse course and tell their supporters that it's actually okay to vote by mail after enacting these laws, as you mentioned, and then sort of sowing doubt about them and then reversing course again? It's fascinating.
Can you talk a little bit more, or talk a little bit about the far right actors that you reported on?
I mean, I suppose, often politically motivated criticism, but I think what I think is definitely sort of like a fair question. It's like, how can you call these people extremists or whatever? You know what I mean? And it's pretty simple. When you have a group like the Proud Boys, it's not just the fact that not just what they believe, and some of their beliefs are fringe, and they've changed throughout the years, and they emphasize some things and not. It's a little bit inconsistent. Actually, it's very inconsistent. But what makes them extreme is their willingness to use violence. When it comes to the Oath Keepers, the Oath Keepers were obviously very less involved in street violence and street protests, but certainly they were armed, and they were a militia, and they were prepared to use their guns during protests that happened in 2020. When it comes to the Proud Boys, I spent a week in Portland, Oregon, with some Proud Boys who had been regularly involved in the political violence there. And this was even before the nightly protests and fights and battles that happened throughout 2020, which I think are still perhaps, there's been some great reporting on those things, but the level of violence that happened there and sort of the length of it that it happened for is kind of like astounding, and probably bears some more research. But anyway, when I was there, they portrayed themselves as standing up for traditional American values. Hey, men are men, and women are women, and we need a closed border, and everybody should have a gun. Those are like not necessarily extremist views. I mean, a lot of people hold them. So it's like, how can you sort of call them fringe? It's very difficult. On the other hand, I spoke to the sort of de facto leader of the Portland area Proud Boys, a man named Tusitala Tuese. His nickname was Tiny. His nickname was Tiny because he was enormous, incredibly strong man. He was well over 6 feet tall and had huge muscles. He bragged that he had been arrested, I believe, 18 times. So it was very interesting to hear somebody saying, yeah, we need law and order, and we want the violent Antifa thugs off the streets, and then be very proud of his very, very long arrest record. He's now serving a sentence of about 8 years in prison because he finally, I suppose, just ran out of luck when it came to the justice system. So, these are the people who obviously were out in force again on January the 6th. They're not necessarily the furthest to the extremes when we talk about these groups, because there's other underground groups. If you carry on past the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, there's groups like Patriot Front, which are less into street brawling and more into propaganda.
They're white supremacists, correct?
Yeah, they're classic white supremacists. And, some of their rhetoric is interesting because it's things that I have rarely seen on the far right, which is sort of like anti-native kind of stuff. So they have one banner that they sort of put up that says "Stolen, not conquered" over a picture of the United States, trying to push back at, a greater awareness of, the people who were here before European Americans were here. then you can go even further to the extremes. And in the book, I go into the terrorgram loose movement that targets infrastructure and are completely very violent and nihilistic, and probably no fans of the Republican Party, Donald Trump, or any sort of politician who would be elected, to any sort of mainstream office. But the potential for violence is there. These are movements. Perhaps the biggest threat that we've seen and is realized, it's certainly not potential, it's real, is so-called lone wolf actors, people who in Pittsburgh, in Buffalo, who have done these mass shootings based on their own sort of ideas of white supremacy and racism. Now, the only thing I would say is, the phrase lone wolf just does not necessarily, is not like an accurate description, really, because behind these people is a vast ecosystem, an online propaganda machine. They're consuming these kinds of things. They're on social networks. They're talking to people and they're receiving messages. So they certainly aren't alone in any sense of that word.
You actually talked to Stewart Rhodes' son, Dakota Adams, when you visited Montana. He's actually running for Congress today.
Yes.
One of the things he said that he told you that stuck with me was that, quote, "I generally have little confidence in the ability of the United States to cope with a rising fascist movement that is being excused and downplayed at every turn to preserve an illusion, the illusion of life as normal." Tell us a little bit about Adams, and then do you agree with his assessment?
First thing I would say is Dakota was, like a very amazing person. A lot of the time I'm talking to people who are actually kind of difficult to be around from all political persuasions. For someone who is, he's only in his early 20s, for someone to be involved in that movement from a very young age, from birth essentially, to have gone through all of that, to have kind of developed his own political ideas, and separately from that, all the while living in a community that gave shelter to the Oath Keepers and his father. And he told me about this at some length. He's not getting any sort of, support from George Soros, as the conspiracy theories might say. He's living in the middle of Montana in a conservative community and trying to provide for his family. And I was full of admiration when I went to go, our crew went to go speak to him and interview him and his mother. As far as his statement, I tried to, I guess, outline that I often think that there are views or people arguing that there's going to be some sort of civil war, I mean, obviously, if you've seen that film, which I didn't really like very much, but it's selling like hotcakes. Lots of people are going to see that film Civil War because it's obviously gotten something in the zeitgeist. I would have dismissed Dakota's talk as somebody who is under a lot of stress, somebody who is just like in a particular community that's, pretty out there on the edge and living amongst these people and feeling like, quite rightfully so, that he might have a target on his back because of his background and how he has publicly pushed his father away. On the other hand, there's lots of people saying this. And in some ways, the mind of, when lots of people say that and they believe it, then other people will be prepared to take action. I've tried to make the point in the book that the day of reckoning is not a sort of a fight. It is not a statement of fact. It's almost in itself a conspiracy theory. It's a theory that nothing will be the same after the November election. And I think probably anybody reasonable, no matter what your political beliefs, no matter who you're going to vote for, can probably agree that we should all just calm down, because there's going to be a winner of the election and there's going to be a loser of the election. And one party is going to win and the other party is going to lose. And the sun will come up the next day and the conspiracy theories will be out there. And, as journalists will try and rebut them. We'll be covering whatever developments happen. But does the outcome of the election really pose an existential crisis to the whole country or our whole sort of system, I think that's highly debatable. And there's people, particularly, I don't want to sort of like make false equivalents here, because obviously the people who were out there on January the 6th were from one particular political persuasion. They were the MAGA people. You did see protests, and some of them turned violent when Trump was elected president. That's true. But there certainly wasn't that organized, concentrated attempt to actually halt the transfer of power. So I'm very wary of trying to make false equivalents here. But on the other hand, I do think that panic is not exclusive to one side, and we should probably critically analyze the source of it. Dakota himself, I can't really sort of put myself in his shoes, which is why I tried to sort of, let him speak in the reporting that I've done on him and in the book, but certainly he views the world in that way, and it's completely understandable because of his background and his current circumstances.
Do you think he represents a wider hope that, more people could kind of be, I don't know if this is a correct term, but like deprogrammed, or just kind of like walk away from their extremism? Or is his case a little different because, by all his accounts, his father at best was a deadbeat, if just not a loser and a horrible father?
Yeah. Certainly his experiences and how he was treated by his father were really pretty crucial. I mean, maybe if his father had been like a nicer guy or sort of more of a family man, then he wouldn't have so publicly rejected him and his ideas. If you talk to experts in de-radicalization of any stripe, and I've spoken to a few of them, and I've done some stories about people who were in these movements and got out. It's incredibly difficult. It usually relies on very deep one-to-one conversations, not usually with a professional, usually with a friend. Say a Jewish person befriends a white nationalist, and the white nationalist doesn't know that they're Jewish, but suddenly they have a bond. I mean, this is a story that's not like hypothetical. It's happened a couple of times in different scenarios. But those kinds of encounters or connections can often be very random. If deprogramming or getting somebody out of extremism was that simple, there would be a formula, and there would be a lot of people devoted to sort of doing that. But it's just not. I have seen Proud Boys disavow the organization because, they had a clash with the leaders of that organization. And that's de-radicalization of one way. They may sort of still think, yes, I'm a supporter of Donald Trump and I believe in the traditional American values, but I'm not going to go out with the Proud Boys and fight. One of the Proud Boys I interviewed in Portland definitely took that path. That path is different from Dakota's path, who, now he's getting very politically active in a very different way, from a very different political perspective, from a progressive political perspective. So, there are many sort of different routes out of radicalization, but it's just a very, very difficult thing, almost impossible to scale. I think probably, the key thing for American democracy will just be to see if election-related violence can be avoided. Can a January the 6th be avoided next January? Because a lot of the people who might be supportive of something like that are actually persuadable to some degree. And I'm not saying persuadable in terms of like, oh yeah, they can be persuaded to vote for Joe Biden or whoever. I'm saying persuadable in saying, hey, you know what? Actually, this is the result of the election, and you may not like it, but don't carry your pepper spray and your big stick and your flagpole and try and storm the Capitol.
I mean, I'm honestly, I'm concerned. I mean, another kind of segment of this, call it radical right or extremist right population, is the Christian right, Christian nationalists, which you also write about in your book, and you even have, again, I guess you would say mainstream candidates like Carrie Lake, talking about strapping on the armor of God and maybe carrying a Glock as we head into November's election. The fact that the Christian nationalist movement, by all accounts, sees democracy as an impediment to their goals. I don't know. I'm pessimistic looking into November, especially, if Trump loses, or even if he wins, right? Who knows? I mean, am I wrong? Or can you walk me back from the ledge with this?
What I always like to say is that I am actually paid not to have a team. I'm paid not to have a dog in the fight. Unfortunately, I probably won't give you much solace here because I think there's a certain amount of election related violence. It's almost inevitable because there is always election violence. There was at least one racist murder and several beatings and lots of uh, you know anti-black graffiti when President Obama was elected. People kind of forget about this kind of thing. Transitions of power in America have actually rarely been like entirely peaceful. I mentioned the riots, protests and riots when Donald Trump was first elected. Obviously, these things were not necessarily on the scale of what we saw at January the 6th, and that was a different order of event. Again, I don't really like to give predictions, but I think it's probably a safe bet that there will be some sort of strife no matter who wins. In terms of Christian nationalists, since actually writing the book, I've done a little bit more reporting on evangelical Christians. And I found a very sort of interesting trend. I was in Iowa and I was talking to some people there, and I talked to a lot of pastors, some of whom were pro-Trump and some of whom were anti-Trump. Almost all of them were Republicans. It's interesting that, during Donald Trump's presidency, the number of evangelicals who do not go to church has increased. And that seems almost like a contradiction, right? So you say that Jesus Christ is your Lord and Savior, but you don't go to church. What that actually means is that they're taking their inspiration from political leaders, from Donald Trump, from people like Mike Flynn, who I go into a little bit of detail in the book. Mike Flynn runs sort of like a traveling roadshow, a Christian nationalist, almost sort of like barnstorming tour. From what I have gleaned, I think the interaction between religion and politics is actually kind of is sort of interesting and murky. While there will be a lot of people who will be on board with Mike Flynn, there's others who have a different view of politics or how the church should get involved in politics. You know what I mean? Like it's actually evangelical community in America is so large that it's actually fairly diverse. And then you just get to practicalities, right? What is going to spur Mike Flynn supporters to start an armed rebellion or something like this? You know what I mean? I'm not sure, but I think that there's probably an increased awareness of where he's going with his ideas. And there's more journalists over the last year or two. There's been some great reporting from my colleagues at the BBC, from the Associated Press, from PBS Frontline on this movement. In some ways, I feel like as these things evolve, it's not impossible to sort of keep tabs on where they're going. And that limits their effectiveness to some degree. And that's probably as much of a solace that I can give you, Cyril. I'm sorry to say. I always tell people, I guess, like particularly like my British friends, they're like, "Hey, you're American. You're a journalist. Tell me what's going to happen. Reassure me." And really, for most of them, they would just want to be reassured that Donald Trump is not going to be elected again. And I just say to them, you know what? What you have to do is you got to be prepared for anything, right? And you also have to know that politics is not just one election. It could happen that Joe Biden is reelected. It could happen that Donald Trump is elected. Something could happen that could throw a complete curveball. You just keep your mind open and don't, like the conspiracy theorists do, put all of your chips on November and think that there is going to be an endpoint that happens because somebody might get a few more votes in Bucks County than the other person, and that's going to swing the whole thing. Politics is more than just one vote.
Absolutely. And it's what you're doing every day before election day and after, which counts. And we're seeing a lot of like organizing and mobilizing, against Christian nationalism, against far right movements in communities across the United States. And that's something that's encouraging. And then one thing people can do, and just to wrap this interview up, is to go ahead and order Mike's book, which is Day of Reckoning.
Please do, please.
How the far right waged war on democracy. And we'll see in the coming months and through next year who's going to win this war.
Yeah, Day of Reckoning, and it's out. It's out on the 20th of May, but obviously you can pre-order from wherever you get your books.
Yes, go to your local bookstore, Newtown Bookstore, Doylestown Bookshop, Farley's in New Hope, or order it online. And I can't recommend it enough. Mike, thanks so much for your time. Thank you for writing this very important book. And I hope to have you on again in the future.
Well, yeah, anytime. Thanks for your questions. Thanks for a really interesting conversation.
This has been The Signal, a podcast by the Bucks County Beacon. I'm Cyril Mychalejko, editor-in-chief and host. For more progressive news, analysis, and opinion from Bucks County and beyond, go to www.buckscountybeacon.com.